On the morning of July 10th, 1981, a man was shot to death in the middle of a Missouri street, while somewhere between 30 and 50 people stood watching. The FBI investigated. 3 separate grand juries were convened. Not one witness, not a single person out of those dozens standing right there in the open air in broad daylight ever identified the shooter. That is not a case that went cold. That is a town that decided. I've been thinking about Skidmore, Missouri for a long time now, longer than I care to count. And the more I think about it, the more I find that the silence, that extraordinary collective decades-long silence, is the real story. The shooting took maybe 3 seconds. The silence has lasted more than 40 years, and I think if you want to understand how ordinary, decent people arrive at a moment like that, you have to start not with the man who was killed, but with the place itself, with what it meant to live there, with what had been done to that place and to those people for a very long time before anyone reached for a gun. It's a small place. It was small then, and it's smaller now. Sit yourself down at a gas station map from 1981, and you could miss it entirely, just a dot in Nottoway County, maybe 90 minutes north of Kansas City, surrounded by flat farmland that goes on until it meets the sky. Population 440, give or take. The kind of town where you know your neighbor's truck by the sound of the engine, where you know which family's corn is running a week late, where a stranger parking on Main Street gets noticed before he's even opened the car door. The man who was shot was named Ken Rex McElroy. His wife Trina was sitting right beside him in the passenger seat when it happened. She saw everything. When investigators arrived, local police, then state, then the FBI, they asked the same questions of the same witnesses again and again. I didn't see anything people said. Nobody saw a thing. Now, before I tell you how a town full of ordinary people came to stand in the street and watch a man be killed, and then agree never to speak of it, I need to tell you about the place itself. Because Skidmore wasn't an angry place by nature. It wasn't rough or reckless or prone to violence. It was a farming community. It had a grain elevator and a lumber yard and a post office and a tavern. It had a grocery store run by a man named Ernest Bowenkamp, who everyone called Bo, and his wife Lois, who gave credit when families ran short between harvests. It had churches. It had a school. It had the ordinary architecture of a modest American life, the kind of life built on the assumption that if you worked hard, if you kept your nose clean, if you were decent to your neighbors, the world would more or less leave you alone. Most of the families in and around Skidmore had been there for generations. They'd farmed the same ground their grandparents farmed. Their names were on the same church records and the same cemetery markers. They knew each other in the deep, complicated way that only comes from decades of proximity. They'd borrowed each other's equipment and argued over fence lines, and sat together in the hospital waiting room and helped each other put up hay when the weather threatened. That kind of knowing. The kind where you don't need to say very much because most things are already understood. That kind of community has its own immune system, its own sense of what belongs and what doesn't. And for more than 20 years, there was something in Skidmore that absolutely did not belong. Ken Rex McElroy was born in 1934, the 15th of 16 children. His parents were poor tenant farmers who moved between Kansas and the Ozarks before settling outside Skidmore. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade and never learned to read or write. By the time he was a young man, he had already made himself known in the county for a specific set of skills: stealing livestock, avoiding consequences and making absolutely certain that anyone who crossed him understood the cost. He was by most accounts a physically imposing man, big through the shoulders, hard-looking. He had slicked back hair and a way of looking at people that one local lawman described years later as putting you into defense mode without him having to say a single word. He drove a series of pickup trucks and kept dogs, big ones, and lived on a property at the edge of town with a succession of young women and a collection of children, some of whom were by the time they were old enough to walk already being pulled into his orbit of menace. He was a cattle rustler in the old sense. In the dead of night, he'd back a truck up to a farmer's fence line and load whatever he could reach. He'd sell the animals at auction or to buyers who knew better than to ask questions. He stole hogs. He stole equipment. He burglarized homes. He burned things. When a farmer caught him red-handed stealing horses and filed charges, McElroy showed up and smashed the man across the face with a rifle butt. The charges were withdrawn. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. Witnesses would come forward, then they would recant, or they would simply not show up to testify, or they would show up and find somewhere in their memory that things had become uncertain, that they couldn't be quite as sure as they thought they were. And in the spaces between their certainty and their fear, Ken McElroy walked free. He was charged with crimes 21 times in theft cases alone. He was convicted almost never. He had a lawyer in Kansas City, a man named Richard McFadden, who was said to be excellent at his work and who handled 3 or 4 of McElroy's felonies per year. McFadden once called McElroy the best client he'd ever had. Punctual, he said. Always insisted he didn't do it. Paid in cash, kept coming back. What McElroy understood in a way that most people living honest lives never have to understand was the precise architecture of fear. He knew how to make a man afraid without touching him. He knew that if you park your truck outside someone's farmhouse at 2 in the morning and let the engine idle and sit there for 20 minutes without doing anything, just sit there, you don't need to say a word. The message arrives on its own. He used this technique often. One farmer he had a dispute with reported that McElroy parked outside his home more than 100 times. Just parked there, waiting, reminding. The local police knew who he was. The sheriff's deputies knew. A deputy named Boyer, who encountered McElroy on a traffic stop late one night, said he drew his service weapon and wouldn't have been surprised if McElroy tried something. A few nights later, a pickup truck appeared outside Boyer's remote house at 2 in the morning. It drove past, came back, and sat there for 20 seconds before leaving. Boyer couldn't prove it was McElroy. He waited behind a tree in his yard with a shotgun. That is what this man made of people. That is what he reduced them to, even people whose job it was to protect the public. He made everyone smaller, made everyone afraid. And for 20 years, the system, the courts, the jails, the whole apparatus meant to stand between the vulnerable and the violent, failed to do a single meaningful thing about it. By 1980, most of the people in and around Skidmore had been living with Ken McElroy as a fact of life for 2 decades. They had learned to work around him, to avoid him, to look away when he drove past on the road. They had learned not to file charges, or if they filed them, not to follow through. They had learned that the law was not going to save them. Some of them had learned this lesson more than once. But 1980 brought something different. It started with something almost absurdly small. One of McElroy's daughters went into Bo Bowenkamp's grocery store with McElroy's wife, Trina. and there was some kind of dispute, a misunderstanding maybe, about whether the girl had tried to take a piece of candy without paying. Beau's wife Lois was there. Words were exchanged. Nobody was hurt. It was the kind of minor friction that happens 10 times a day in any small-town store and is forgotten before the screen door swings shut. But Ken McElroy did not forget things. Ken McElroy did not let things go. He decided that his family had been accused of stealing, and so he began to haunt Beau Bowenkamp the way he had haunted everyone else who had ever offended him. He parked outside the store. He followed the old man. He made threats, the kind of low specific threats that can't be proved in court, but leave no doubt about their intent. Beau Bowenkamp was 70 years old. He'd lived in Skidmore his whole life. He and Lois had built that grocery store and fed that community for decades. And now he couldn't walk to his own loading dock without looking over his shoulder. Then one day in 1980, McElroy walked into the back of the store with a shotgun and shot Beau Bowenkamp in the neck. Beau survived. Somehow Beau survived. The bullet passed through without killing him, and he recovered and he lived to testify in court. And for a moment, for one brief, fragile moment, it looked as though the system might finally do something. McElroy was charged with first-degree assault, which carried a possible life sentence. The case went to trial. Beau took the stand and told what happened. McElroy took the stand and said Beau had come at him with a knife, and it was self-defense. The jury convicted him. Second-degree assault. 2 years. 2 years for shooting a 70-year-old man in the neck. And then, as if to make absolutely certain that no one in Skidmore would ever trust the law again, the judge allowed McElroy out on bond pending appeal. He walked out of the courthouse a free man. He drove to the D&G Tavern. He walked in carrying an M1 Garand rifle with a bayonet fixed to the barrel. And in front of witnesses he talked about what he was going to do to Beau Bowenkamp. This was a clear violation of his bond conditions. The witnesses came forward. They told what they'd seen. A hearing was scheduled, and then McFadden had it delayed, and then delayed again. There is a word for what the people of Skidmore felt in those days, but I'm not sure the language has a precise enough term for it. It wasn't just anger. It was something older and colder than anger. It was the feeling of a community looking at the thing that was supposed to protect them and seeing finally and completely that it would not, that it couldn't, or that it wouldn't, and that by now, after 20 years, the distinction no longer mattered. The morning of July 10th, 1981 was hot. Missouri in July is that particular kind of hot that sits on you, humid air that makes the grain shimmer at a distance and turns the dust on the road to something almost golden. It was a Friday. Earlier that morning, a group of men gathered at the American Legion Hall in Skidmore. They'd asked the Nottoway County Sheriff to come. They wanted to talk about what could be done. The sheriff came and listened. He suggested they form a neighborhood watch. He advised them strongly not to confront McElroy directly. He left town. At some point while this meeting was happening, Ken McElroy and his wife Trina arrived at the D&G Tavern for a morning drink. People knew he was there. Word moves fast in a town of 440. When the meeting at the Legion Hall broke up, the men walked down the street toward the tavern. Others joined them as they walked. By the time they gathered in front of the D&G, there were somewhere between 30 and 50 people standing on that street. Bank tellers watching from windows, grocery clerks, farmers, neighbors, people who had been afraid for a long time. McElroy came out of the tavern and walked to his truck, a Silverado pickup. He got in behind the wheel. Train was in the passenger seat. The crowd stood in the street and on the sidewalk around the truck, close enough that you could have reached out and touched the hood. Nobody was speaking, or if they were, it was very quietly. The heat pressed down on everything. Then the shots came. How many shots from how many guns from which directions? These are things that have been argued about and investigated and argued about again for more than 40 years. What is not disputed is that Ken McElroy was struck by bullets from at least 2 different firearms. What is not disputed is that he was killed almost instantly. What is not disputed is that his wife was in the seat beside him, unharmed, screaming. What is also not disputed is that nobody called an ambulance. The crowd dispersed. Some people went back to work. Some went home. The truck sat on the main street of Skidmore with its windows shattered, and Ken McElroy slumped behind the wheel, and the town went quiet. When the investigators arrived, they found a crime scene with no shortage of witnesses and a complete absence of testimony. Deputies took statements. Nobody saw anything. The FBI came. Nobody saw anything. A local grand jury was convened. A state grand jury. Eventually, a federal investigation. Nobody saw anything. Trina McElroy told investigators she believed she knew who had fired the shots. She gave a name. The man she named was never charged. Nobody else corroborated her account. In 1984, she filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the town of Skidmore, the county, and several named individuals. The case was settled out of court 3 years later for $17,600. No one admitted guilt. Trina remarried, moved away, and died of cancer in 2012 on her 55th birthday. The national media descended on Skidmore in the weeks and months that followed the killing. Television crews, newspaper reporters. The story had a quality that made it irresistible. The small town, the bully, the crowd, the silence. People had opinions. Some thought the town had done something courageous. Some thought it had done something monstrous. Most, if they were honest, thought it had done something they couldn't quite categorize. The people of Skidmore, for the most part, stopped talking to reporters. There's a moment that stays with me, something a deputy described many years later. He was at the crime scene taking measurements doing his job, and a local official came up to him and asked what he was doing. The deputy explained, and the official looked at him not with hostility exactly, but with something more complicated than that and said, "Why are you doing this? You know what he was like. You know how he oppressed us. I don't believe you're coming now after we needed your help all this time." That exchange has always seemed to me to contain the whole moral weight of what happened in Skidmore. It doesn't justify anything. It doesn't explain everything, but it tells you something true about what it means when a community is left alone with a problem for 20 years and told in so many different ways that help is not coming. There are questions about Skidmore that I've turned over in my mind for years, and I'm not sure I'm any closer to answers than I was when I started. Was what happened justice? I don't know. It had the shape of justice in the way that a thing done to end suffering can feel like justice in the moment. But justice usually has a face. It usually has a name attached. It has a process, however imperfect, that allows for the possibility of being wrong. What happened on that street had none of those things. It was something else, something older, something that predates courtrooms and constitutions. Call it community verdict. Call it collective exhaustion reaching its limit. Call it something that happens when people become absolutely convinced that no one is coming to help them. What I know is that the people of Skidmore did not do what they did lightly. These were not violent people. These were farmers and shopkeepers and bank clerks, people who went to church on Sundays and helped each other with the harvest and worried about their children's futures. They had spent 20 years trying to do things the right way, filing charges, testifying, going to the sheriff, trusting the courts. And 20 years of trying the right way had left them exactly where they started, except older and more frightened, and with a 70-year-old grocer who had been shot in the neck. And when I think about the silence that followed, that long community-wide silence that held for decades and has never fully broken, I don't think it was only the silence of self-protection, though. It was certainly that. I think it was also the silence of people who weren't entirely sure what they felt, who had watched something happen that they'd maybe half wanted for years, and now that it had happened, they didn't know how to live with the wanting, didn't know how to explain it to their children, didn't know how to pray about it on Sunday morning. Harry McLean, the lawyer and writer who spent years in Skidmore researching his book on the case, said the most baffling question the whole story raised was this: how did an illiterate man who had no bank account and no social security number, a man who could barely function in the modern world, manage to outwit the entire criminal justice system for 20 years? How did he keep walking away? I think about that question often because the answer matters, not just for Skidmore, not just for what happened on that July morning, but for what it says about the systems we build to protect people, and what happens to those people when the systems fail them, and how long we expect ordinary human beings to absorb that failure before something gives. I'm not going to tell you the name of who fired the shots. I don't know for certain who did it, and even if I did, I'm not sure it would change much now. Most of the people who were on that street are dead. The town itself has shrunk even smaller. The D&G Tavern is long gone. Bo Bowenkamp died years ago, quietly having outlived the man who shot him. The case has never been officially closed. It never will be. What's left is the question itself. What's left is a small town in northwest Missouri that did something no one can quite explain and then kept its silence with a discipline that FBI agents and grand juries and documentary filmmakers and true crime podcasters have never been able to break. What's left is a street where on a hot July morning in 1981, 40 or 50 ordinary people made an extraordinary decision and lived the rest of their lives inside it. I think about that sometimes when I drive through small towns, when I see a grain elevator against a flat sky, when I see a man sitting in a pickup truck outside a bar, just sitting there watching the street. I think about what it means to live somewhere, what it means to protect somewhere, what you owe the place you come from, and what it costs to pay that debt. I don't have answers. I'm not sure anyone does. But I think the questions are worth sitting with for a while. I think they deserve that much at least.